Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's CX Quick Tips. And now remember, we only spent about 10 minutes, so we're going to get into some good dialogue quickly. And I'm really excited about the guest that we have on our show today because I just love her energy and I love her insight. And I think we're going to have a great discussion. And for me, it actually is going to cue up some other discussions, and hopefully we'll have her on again soon. So I have Megan Burns with me. Megan, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Now, you and I had a little bit of off-mic discussion. I don't know if we'll be able to pull some of those things in, but I think it really leans heavily into what we're going to talk about today, and that is a secret weapon, that CX leaders probably aren't using to its full effect, and you state that. And it's really all about how do we more effectively go through the CX transformation process. So tell us a little bit about a secret weapon that we need to use more of.
Sure. We use it all the time. We just don't use it terribly thoughtfully. The secret weapon is words or language. I've been a word nerd for as long as I can remember. If you ask my parents, I taught myself how to read, and they're not prone to hyperbole. So if they say it, it's probably true. But I've always been fascinated by what words mean and sort of the subtle differences. So that nerdiness in me led to me using words as an analytical tool, right? So I remember when I first started working on the customer experience maturity model, what does it mean to be mature in something? And so really starting to peel apart, what is the concept that word is meant to represent? And I have found that exposes, when you have that conversation with people, it exposes the fact that the vast majority of people have not thought that critically about what it actually is they're trying to do, and that's getting in their way. And so I've ended up with almost all of my clients, when I work with people, whether it's explicit or not, having a conversation about, well, what do you mean by that? Why did you call it that? Is it this or is it that? Creates a degree of clarity inside the organization that breaks down a lot of the silos and organizational barriers much more easily than anyone would think.
Okay, so as you're talking, I start, hearing sometimes I have had it as I guess you'd say a rebuttal or things like that, where people, are really trying to, or I should say collectively, we're trying to get to some clarity, right? And I am potentially positioning and saying things a certain way. And we ultimately may find out that we're kind of on the same page, and then they will rebut to me and say, well, that's just semantics. And I'm like, but the semantics are vital.
Yeah. So I think you bring up an excellent point, which is that nuance is academically important and often practically limiting. Right. So I'm all about the nuance. I mean, you and I could geek out on a conversation about what counts as a customer journey for probably an hour and a half. But when I'm talking to the C-suite of a client company, or even when I'm talking to the IT team or the marketing team, they have a sense of that word that doesn't include the nuance. They don't care. They're not worried about it. So it's up to me to find out and understand. I either have to make them see, or help them see, I shouldn't say make, help them see why the nuances are important, or adjust myself as the person who knows more about this topic to talk about something the way they see it. And journeys is actually a great example. I'm doing some research with a client right now, and it turns out when we talk about customer journey mapping with their marketing team, every single one of them means buyer journey. How does a buyer make decisions? Not how I think about the definition of a customer journey. But after about 4 interviews, it became clear that if you're talking about a journey map, they mean a buyer journey, and it's a totally different thing than what we do in CX.
That's very interesting. And okay, so this is part of the discussion that we had off mic that I think probably now is good to queue up. And, really our audience and how we're, positioning, how we're, painting pictures and using words and, those important semantics and nuances, all of those need to shift. And there was a study that I came across, it was probably a couple of years ago, and it made sense to me because I've had the opportunity to sit in on a couple boards. is that when you start talking about the discussion that happens at the boardroom level, is the vast majority of the discussions are threat-based. It's 85% plus is all about how do we mitigate, how do we therefore eliminate, reduce, get rid of, avoid. I mean, and it goes everything from inside the organization to outside the organization to competition to government. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So if I'm thinking about that whole audience and connecting with my audience, how much does the typical aspirational message of a CX leader, need to change?
I don't know if it's the message as much as it is it is the message and how you build to the message. Quite frankly, I think we've done ourselves a disservice as a CX space by being a little bit too rah-rah and acting a little bit like customer experience is the silver bullet. It's not. I firmly believe that for a lot of companies, good enough is good enough from a customer experience perspective. But A, that's not sort of the popular thing. And B, well, if it's not, we want to have the world's best customer experience. We want to be the Amazon of our industry. Then what is it? Right? And the idea that you can be thoughtful and intentional about getting the basics right, like what does customer experience management mean? Even if you're not trying to, deliver the wow all the time. And so I think part of adjusting that messaging comes back. It starts in a place of acknowledging that customer experience is a tool. It's a tool you have to think carefully about how you want to use, but it's not a panacea. And then what is the best way to use it to deal with the threats? So a lot of my clients are B2B. Their number one threat is churn, losing clients. And so the customer experience conversation is extremely relevant there. Other folks who are maybe more focused on acquiring new customers and differentiation, it might be a loss of market share. So you can position it and think it, but I think that the sort of tone and temperature of the conversation is a big piece of whether or not it feels like it connects with a board or a C-suite audience.
Well, and you had mentioned something about, shaping how we see the world with these, the words that we're using. And so for me, I start also as we're going through talking about these different stakeholders is that there's different models. In order for you to be able to be effective, we can't rely on our default model, right? Because our default model has been formulated by a lot of different sources and inputs, including all the way going back to our childhood, right? I mean, we're always having our default systems be formulated, in a lot of different ways. But in order for me to have success that's enduring, everlasting, and scalable, and all of those things, is I have to follow some models. So, do you help to prescribe certain models based on the message, based on what I'm trying to accomplish? Because the reality is transformation is painful, and I don't care what type it is. Whether it's digital, customer experience, it's painful.
Yeah, it is. So I have one model that I use a lot with clients. It's called the moments of change model. And the idea is that if you look at the way change happens inside the human brain, it happens in little increments that build on each other. We hear new evidence and go, that's interesting. We start to see 7, 8, 9 people acting a different way. And we start to believe that, maybe it really is okay to act in a different way. So I focus with companies on looking at what's the day-to-day evidence that people need to see to believe that the world is different than they thought it was, and that the best way for them to act is a different way than they were acting before. So from a change model, that's my approach. But honestly, the other model I use is just asking innocent questions. So I'll give you an example. I had a client, I've had many clients that fit this description, where they went to great lengths and spent 6 months to a year making sure they had a really precise NPS calculation and did nothing about it. And the reason they did nothing about it is because nobody could answer the question, who owns customer experience? And the root cause of that was even one level deeper, because I said, all right, forget about who. What does it mean to own something in your organization? Blank stare. And so we end up having a 2-day discussion about, well, ownership includes, having the authority over something. You get to make decisions. That's the part everybody wants. Having the responsibility to actually do work. People are less keen on that. And then having the accountability, which, let's face it, practically speaking, is, who's not going to get their bonus if this doesn't work, or who's, potentially on the chopping block. And you can't have one without the other. But this going in circles about, well, who owns and who should own what part of the customer experience, just forcing people to talk about what does it mean to own something and what are the things to be owned, breaks that log jam in a way that sometimes I don't even have to guide them. I just ask the questions and they do the thinking.
Yeah, and going back to that default mechanism, I think a lot of times ownership gets supplanted or replaced by accountability, and we go straight to that.
Depends on the culture. I did a totally unscientific LinkedIn survey last year about, when you hear accountability, does it have a positive or a negative connotation? And I got a much more of a mix of both than I was expecting. Typically, folks, in terms of corporate culture, accountability is a negative, but from a personal perspective, they think taking accountability for your own actions is a positive thing. So, these things are coloring our conversations, whether we think about them or not.
Okay, so now let's bring it home. Talking about the CX leader's secret weapon and how to turn it into a full potential. What do we need to do?
You need to ask people, what do you mean by that? No matter what it is, or can you give me an example? That's going to open up gaps and miscommunications and just things that you didn't know in a way that no amount of sort of data-based persuasion is ever going to do. Just, what do you mean by that?
There was another good one that I heard along the lines I think is helpful, and that is just to say, tell me more.
That too. Yeah. Tell me more.
Yeah. Tell me more. Megan Burns, I had a good time chatting with you today. And I know there's probably a dozen or more nuggets that we pulled out of this that I know are going to help us to go through that painful CX transformation a lot easier. So how do the CX Quick Tip listeners actually get in touch with you?
Sure. So there's two ways. You can always email me at Megan, MEGAN, at megan-burns.com. Or the easiest way is probably LinkedIn. It's the regular LinkedIn URL / Megan Burns. That's where I am most of the time. And you'll actually find every Wednesday I publish something called Word Nerd Wednesday, which is just exploring the origin or use or history of a word. Sometimes it's fun and goofy. Sometimes it's really sort of serious and strategic. But if you're into words, that's something most people tell me they really love.
Well, and just remember, it's not just semantics. Megan Burns, it's not. Thanks for joining us on CX Quick Tips and sharing your knowledge and wisdom, and we wish you the very best.
Thanks, Jim.